When my wife was 22 years old, she found herself living alone with twins. The guy she had been living with before that, they split up, went their separate ways. She was pregnant, not sure if he even knew the twins existed at that point. She was trying to crawl her way out of poverty, living off welfare and trying to go back to school, trying to manage 2 young kids all by herself. She had been estranged from family for a while. Her mom was a bit of a support, but the rest of the family, not so much at all. They were all a family that had come out of difficulty. One time we were at a family reunion. Years later, there'd be maybe 200 people in the room, and I bet you there was 5 high school diplomas. And there was, he's been in jail, she's been in jail. She used to be married to him, but now she's married to him. And it was a mess. A very dysfunctional family, sideways, up and down. At one point, she decides she wants to try to reunite with any member of her family that would care about her and these 2 little twin girls she had. And the grandma that she had not known or liked very well, and the grandma didn't like her much, they were a Puerto Rican family, and of course she wasn't the boy. Her brothers were honored and loved and cherished, but as the girl, she was not thought about much. And so she decided, I'm going to try to maybe have a relationship with my grandma, and maybe she'll care about these twins. And so her grandma came over and decided to spend the night with her. She'd never spent the night with her in her life. She doesn't ever remember spending the night at her grandma's house as a kid. And so her grandma comes over to meet her grandbabies, to hang out in this little divey apartment down in San Jose or Santa Clara, and she plays with the babies and has a really nice time. She puts grandma to bed that night on the couch, and she goes to sleep. And when she wakes up the next morning, grandma had died on the couch. She had rolled off the couch, had a heart attack. My wife calls the paramedics and whatnot, whoever. She's kind of scrambling. I don't know who to call or what to do. They come and they take her away. And at 22 years old and in poverty and struggling without family support, without any help much whatsoever, she suddenly decides, maybe God has answers for me. Maybe I should look at God. They were not a church-going family. Nobody in the whole history of other than a wedding or a funeral, nobody ever attended church in any way, shape, or form of any kind. Up, down, sideways, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, nobody went to church in her family. And so she decides, I'm going to try to maybe see if Jesus is real. Maybe there's answers there. Maybe there's something that can come greater in life. She literally in those days grabbed the yellow pages, flipped through the yellow pages for churches, and kind of went, boom, picked a nearby church and went to it for the first time in her life at 22 years old. That would lead to her coming to saving faith, and that would lead to her baptism, and her journey would begin. And a couple years later, she'd come to our church where I was on staff working as a program director, and we would meet, and the rest would be history for us. It's amazing how many times you're just sort of cruising through life, and you get woken up to have to deal with Jesus, right? I got woken up to deal with Jesus. A friend of mine was inviting me to his church. I'm like, okay, he kind of lured me in through a bicycle trip, but before it would all be said and done, I would watch a friend drown. He was a Christian and I was not, and that's where I got woken up to deal with Jesus. Sometimes it's crisis in your life, sometimes it's death, sometimes it's just something that may happen, but sooner or later you might have this moment come in your life. And I have found, in my experience, most of the time it is crisis. Most of the time with people, it's crisis or these longings, there's something that my life isn't working or the answers I thought I had don't work. And in that moment comes this face-to-face awakening with Jesus. And usually it begins as an experiment or some kind of investigation. Us sitting sort of in judgment of Jesus. I'm going to analyze this Jesus. I'm going to look at this Jesus. I'm going to sit in judgment of whether he's true or whether he's real or not or whether he's the legit thing. And I'll make a decision about what I'm going to do with him. It just kind of falls in those veins. And we find ourselves caught up often in a journey that's even bigger than we realized. There was a day when Pontius Pilate was going to wake up that morning, go about his normal day, typical holiday season for what was going on in the city that he was in charge of, and he comes face to face through death with Jesus. And what happens in this exchange between Pilate and Jesus is often a reflection of how we also look at Jesus. It's a fascinating, interesting, weaving story of this person who had no intention of meeting Jesus that day, who had no intention of investigating him, who had no intention of having anything to do with Jesus, suddenly be confronted with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the great I Am. Let's look at the story together. It's found in John chapter 18. And it's an interesting story. I'm going to backtrack just a tiny bit before Jesus meets up with Pilate, because as we kind of heard from Chris and this whole arrest in the garden last week, he approached that whole sense of Peter and the denial that Peter was going through with Jesus, and Jesus being arrested in the garden and yanked into these courts. I'm going to deal with the courts that were going on simultaneously as Peter was going through his denial process of whether or not he wanted to stand by Jesus to the end. And in John chapter 18, we'll look at the first couple of verses which will kind of unpack this whole story. And I'm going to look at verses 12 and 14. You're going to need your Bible open today because we're going to be looking at some verses. And I'm not going to put them on the screen for you and make it easy. You get a Bible, get it in your hands, and we'll be flipping through it. John chapter 18, verse 12. It says, "Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people." Okay, let's just pause here a second and understand what's going on. In the garden, the troops come, they arrest Jesus, his followers all flee. Peter does the thing with a sword, tries to cut off Malchus's ear, Jesus heals it. They all run away. Now they've bound Jesus, and they're going to take him to this court. This is a nighttime, dead of night experience that's going on. They've come with torches, and the first place they go is to this guy Annas' house, which is kind of weird because it's like at some level, officially, he's a nobody. But unofficially, he's the power behind everything going on in the Jewish culture. Annas was an interesting guy. He actually had emerged in the aftermath of Herod the Great, the one who had tried to kill baby Jesus. He dies, and he splits his kingdom up upon his death. In his will, he had split it up into 4 pieces and doled them out to his sons, and each one took an area. And the one that was took the area of Judea and that whole area of Jerusalem was his son Archelaus. And when baby Jesus comes back from Egypt, and they're going to settle back in Bethlehem, that's when they decide not to settle in Bethlehem, but go up to Nazareth, because Archelaus was running the show in that region. Archelaus was a brutal, bloodthirsty, corrupt leader. He was so bad that at one point the Romans basically, and the governors around there said, we got to get rid of this guy because he's killing people. His whole idea of putting down any kind of questioning is to have folks massacred. He's just brutal, he's awful, he's hideous. And so the Romans got rid of him. And when they got rid of him, they decided to take that whole region and turn it into a governor's province. Prior to that, it had belonged to King Herod. It had been an independent city-state or an independent region of a kingdom. And, of course, they were still a puppet kingdom to Rome, but they were their own kingdom. Well, now they're going to basically take it over, and it's not even going to be a puppet kingdom anymore. Rome's going to own it. And so they move in, and when they own it, one of the first things they do is sort of get rid of everybody who is in any kind of power with Archelaus, and they install new positions everywhere across the board, and they need a new high priest. And so Rome picks Annas to be the high priest in AD 7. And so Annas becomes the official high priest. But in AD 14, some other stuff happened. A new governor came along. Different things there'd been some turmoil. There's a possibility that they had gotten rid of Annas. It's hard to understand when I'm following in the Josephus history, because there was a guy named Ananus who was a high priest who was trying to execute all of his enemies. And they decided, well, we're going to take away the power of execution, the power of criminal punishment from you then. It might have been this Annas, not exactly sure, but he basically gets deposed as the high priest in AD 14. So for 7 years, he'd been the high priest. Now, the problem is, the Romans coming in appointing the high priest is not how it's done. In the Jewish world, when you were elected high priest, you were high priest for your entire life. It was a lifetime appointment. And the next high priest would not come until you died. That's how the scriptures had laid it out. So the Romans coming in and deposing Annas and setting up new high priests, and they set up another guy, and that didn't last long. And next thing you know, Annas he jockeys and has his son made high priest, and then they get rid of him, and then they put another on. And basically what will happen is, before it's all said and done, 4 of Annas' son and his son-in-law Caiaphas would be the high priest over the next 50 years, right? Who's the power behind the throne? Who's the real power in Jerusalem? Annas is the real power. He gets everything done that he wants. So he's setting up in this lifetime position. So for the Jewish people, because Annas had never died, for the Jewish people, he's kind of the real high priest. Even though the Romans have set up officially and on paper and in the government forms and at all the ceremonies and things, Caiaphas, his son-in-law, is the current high priest in Jesus' time. And so when they first arrest Jesus, the first thing they do is take him to Annas, the real power behind the throne. The courtyards that were outside the temple where Jesus had turned over the tables, where Jesus had knocked things down, where he had set the sheep free and that kind of thing, because he was so angry at the buying and selling. The actual name for those courtyards at that time was the Bazaars of Annas. Who was making the money? Who was the one making all that? And we're talking about the kind of things you do the comparison. It's like a pair of pigeons on the open market that were supposed to be used for sacrifice would sell for $2-3. But if you had to go to the temple and buy them, and you had to because they were the only ones who had the perfect ones, they sold for $75. Right? So you could see the markup was ridiculous. Like a sheep might have been $15-20 to them, but when you go into the market, it would be like $110. So the markup was ridiculous. All that money wasn't flowing into the temple. It was going into Annas' pockets. He was a filthy rich guy. And he was the high priest, he had to say, behind the scenes. But he wasn't the official high priest at the time. So when they grab Jesus, the first thing they do is they don't take him to the official court of Caiaphas. They take him to the unofficial court of Annas. And in verse 19, we pick up how this court ensued. It says, the high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Interesting, the high priest. Wait, the high priest is Caiaphas? No, the high priest is Annas. Which one's the high priest? You could see why it was considered, they both had the title. So this is Annas in verse 20. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple and where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. This first trial of Jesus is put in front of Annas. And it's an interesting trial because it's like, wait, you've arrested a guy and you drag him in here, but you actually have no crime. You're not charging him with anything. He's actually standing in front of Annas, and now Annas is like, okay, let's figure out who you are. And it's interesting because he wants to know what's your doctrine and basically tell me about your disciples. Annas is trying to figure out how big an army do you have behind the scenes? How big is your fighting group? How much unrest, how much civil unrest are you about to cause? What are you really secretly teaching behind the scenes? And it's interesting, kind of weird thing, because Jesus has to say, I don't have any secret teaching. I'm not saying anything offline that I haven't said online. Everything that I am saying, and I've said publicly and openly, everybody's heard me preach by the thousands, indeed probably hundreds of thousands by this time. Everything I've had to say, I've said. Why are you asking me what it is I teach? Why don't you just come down and listen? Or ask anybody who has heard me. And you could walk around this whole city and find people who've heard me teach. They'll tell you what I'm teaching and what I'm saying. But Annas he's got this crazy, suspicious mind. For him, there's nobody who could possibly have power who's not trying to take over. For him, he's thinking, you're trying to take over and I need to eliminate you. And then Jesus standing there gives this answer, and then one of the guards punches him in the face, which is totally against the law in the Jewish law of holding a courtroom. You're supposed to give testimony and then answer with testimony and bring out witnesses and this kind of thing. So Jesus is it's sort of one of those, why are you hitting me? That's completely against the law to be able to do this. And the answer is you bring out someone to testify. You don't have someone you ask a question in a court of law, they give an answer, and you punch them in the face for it. That's not how it's done. And already we're seeing some things emerge where, okay, this whole thing is kind of illegal that's going on. For one, it's a courtroom held at night. They're not allowed to meet at night and hold court. Court by law had to be during the day when everybody could see and participate and hear what's going on. They're holding this court at night. They're holding it in Annas' presence inside Annas' house. They're punching the key witness, and they don't even have a charge to bring. They're trying to figure out what the charge is. After this investigation, then, they take him before Caiaphas. It says here, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now, John in his gospel does not record the meeting with Caiaphas the high priest. He skips over it and jumps straight to Pilate. If you want to hear the meeting with the high priest Caiaphas, you have to go to the other gospels. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 26, and we'll take a look at what happens in front of Caiaphas. Matthew chapter 26, first of the Gospels there. And in Matthew 26, we're going to look at, let's probably start around verse 54. 47, 50, okay. I'll begin about verse 57. Those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." And the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by this living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered and they said, "He's deserving of death." And then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who's the one who hit you?" And then skip over to chapter 27, verse 1. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him up to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Okay, that's the Matthew story. Turn a few pages to the Luke story. Mark will record it in chapter 14, but we're going to skip over that. I'm going to go to the Luke story in chapter 22 of Luke. Luke 22. And Luke 22, we'll start about, let's do this one in Luke 22, let's look at verse 54 here. Having arrested Jesus, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. So that's the same thing that has said in Matthew, where first he goes to Annas' house, and then they take him to Caiaphas' house, where Peter is in the courtyard of Caiaphas' house. This will be important later. Skip down to verse 63. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who's the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." Then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." And then chapter 23. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." And then Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "It is as you say." Okay, let's pause and look at a couple of things that are going on here, because it's an interesting story. They first take Jesus to Annas' house, where he's put on trial in front of Annas. And then they take him to Caiaphas' house. Notice that, where Peter's in the courtyard. And he's put on trial there. Why is that important? Because that's illegal. They're actually putting Jesus on trial, not in the place where the trial is supposed to occur. The great Sanhedrin, who is all the top leaders of the Jewish people, they had a courtyard called the council chambers that was in the temple court. And they would meet, it was called the stone court. They would meet in this stone court in the temple every single day. A bit like our Congress, where on any given day, maybe 2/3 would show, or a third would show, half would show up on any given day. But that's where the Sanhedrin did official business. Anything outside of that temple court was not official business. It was something else going on. And so you have this weird kind of thing where they take Jesus, they're already beating him up on the process of having him. They bring him before Annas, then they take him to Caiaphas' house. And it's in Caiaphas' house where they try to figure out, how can we figure out how to kill this guy? Again, they're sitting here, well, let's bring some witnesses, let's find a crime. Basically, let's find a crime. And they bring these witnesses, and this guy gives false testimony, and that one gives. Now, at Caiaphas' house, some of the scribes, some of the elders, some of the members of the Sanhedrin there are there, but not the whole meeting of the Sanhedrin, and they're actually conducting a trial, not in the place where trials are supposed to occur. It's in a private home. And in this private home, what they're doing is they're trying to rig the system to figure out, how can we kill this guy? And this guy brings a charge, and that guy brings a charge, and this guy says something, and like none of this matters. And finally they get around, they get closer when he says, oh, he said he'd destroy the temple. He could say, oh, hey, that's a good one. Maybe we could use that, right? And so they get it, but if you read the comparison of what's said in Mark and Luke and Matthew, it's like even that charge isn't the same, right? Well, he can rebuild it without human hands in 3 days. No, he said he would do this, and so that becomes the thing. And finally the high priest himself is fed up. He's like, okay, we can't get a charge against this guy, except for maybe one thing. Does he say he's God? If he says he's God, that's blasphemy. That's the one we can get him on. And so Caiaphas, in his own home, stops being the judge of the court. He changes roles, and the judge steps down and becomes the prosecutor. And as the prosecutor, he says, I adjure you by the living God. Basically, he says, I am now making you speak the truth according to God Almighty who sits on the throne. Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And Jesus answers. And he says, I am. And hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of heaven. Hereafter you will see him coming in the clouds of glory. Now, it's interesting, they don't actually judge whether what he's saying is true. Jesus was challenged. Oh, you laid it down. Oh, by the throne of God, you've commanded me to tell the truth? Okay, here's the truth. Yes, I am the Christ. Yes, I am the Son of God. Yes, I am God. And instead of realizing that, hey, you've come face to face with God now, their thing is to sit in judgment of God and to tear his clothes as a sign of mourning, as a sign of outrage, as a sign of sheer terror. This high priest is tearing his clothes as a sign before God Almighty. Oh, I've heard this horrible blasphemy. This man is claiming to be God. That's what we're going to kill him on. He's claiming to be God. And so they all start punching him and beating him. It's interesting that there's actually not a moment there where they say, is he telling the truth? They've already decided. Right? All the miracles he's done aren't brought in as evidence. The miracles that they even know he's done. They never ask, is he telling the truth when he gives that answer? They're only looking for, we've got to kill him. This is the one we can kill him on. However, the right to execute people has been taken away from the Jewish people. The Jewish people don't have the right to execute anyone. The Romans took that right away from them. The Romans said, here, you can try people in court of law and dispense all kinds of punishments, but a capital crime, only the Romans can do that. They took the ultimate power of the sword, they called it. We are the only ones who have the power of the sword. So now, in order for them to have Jesus executed as a criminal, they have to get the Roman government to buy in too. And guess what the Roman government is not going to care one whit about? Whether Jesus says he's the Christ, whether he says he's the Son of God. That is not a crime in Roman law, right? They're going to be like, we're going to drag this guy before Pilate to have him executed, but the charge we're bringing against him, Pilate's not going to care about. It's interesting. So they have this whole thing where this whole court is being held. For one, it's at night. The whole thing's illegal. They've had 3 trials, one in front of Annas and then one in front of Caiaphas. And it was an interesting thing because it said in the morning they met at the council. Did you catch that? They met at the council in the Matthew thing. So what they'd done is after they had this rigged court in Caiaphas' house where they figured out blasphemy is the thing we'll get him on, then they drag him to the main court in the temple, the actual Sanhedrin court, the stone court, where the council was supposed to meet. It's super, super early in the morning, like breaking dawn. And so if these guys are going to assemble, they need a quorum. They need a quorum of the Sanhedrin to punish Jesus. And so what they're going to do is they put the word out with the guys that they know are on their side. They're not calling the whole council. They're calling just enough to have a quorum, and they want to make sure the quorum is their guys. And so in the morning, as it's breaking dawn, they bring Jesus into the official temple court of the actual Sanhedrin so they can check we're following the letter of the law. And now Jesus is put on trial there. And they don't even bother with all the other accusations. When they get there, they just cut right to the chase. Are you the Son of God? Are you claiming to be God? And Jesus' answer said, you've said rightly. Yes, I am. Enough. That trial's good. So they've rubber-stamped the decision that was made in Caiaphas' house after being handed over from Annas' house. Jesus has 3 trials and he hasn't even appeared before Pilate yet. All 3 trials have found him guilty. Guilty of saying he's the Son of God, saying he's the Christ. That's the charge. But as they're getting ready to go in front of Pilate, it's interesting because now they're going to drag him before Pilate. I can't imagine what was going on in Pilate's brain that day. He's showing up in Jerusalem as the governor. He's been the governor of Judea a few years now. And things didn't go well for Pilate when he took over the governorship. He was a pagan Roman. He was newly appointed to this high-level job. He had to have been somebody pretty important to be able to get the governorship. So he was already climbing the social ranks and climbing the political ranks of Rome. He was already a known guy at some level. And he's put in charge of the governorship of Judea. As a pagan guy, he may have been the governor of other regions, but he's never encountered the Jewish monotheistic culture, one God without signs or symbols, no image God before. And his first thing is to parade his strength in Jerusalem. So when he arrives in Jerusalem, actually his capital was Caesarea, which was down on the coast. He climbs up the mountains on the hillside. He marches in with his troops. Well, the Roman troops all had a standard, and on their standard would be the images of this battalion or this particular cohort. And they would often be worshipped by the soldiers because that was the strength of the battalion, right? It was a little more than the pride of a flag. It was like, this on our standard is the God of our battalion, our cohort who keeps us good. And they would kind of do the same thing on their shields and other things. They would use these symbols as images to the gods they were worshiping to make their cohort strong. And when they march into Jerusalem, they're carrying these standards and they're bringing everything in. They've got the emblems on their shield, and the Jews go into an uproar because you're bringing graven images into the capital city of Jerusalem. And there's this huge hullabaloo over that, and that gets back to Rome, and he gets difficult. There's almost a huge riot. He refuses to change anything because, if I give in, I take down the standards of Rome. I take down the power of Rome, the symbols that represent Rome, so that these backwater people can have their say. He refuses. So he marches down to Caesarea. This crowd of Jews follow him all the way down to Caesarea, and he got about 3,000 of them in front of him. And he basically says, you go home or I'm going to have you all executed right now. And all the soldiers surround this crowd, and the crowd, instead of rebelling, bends down and offers their necks to have their heads cut off because they would rather be executed than allow him to have the standards placed in Jerusalem. And Pilate gives in. And he takes down the standards, and from thereafter, when he marches his troops into Jerusalem, they remove all of the standard images. They remove the stuff that represents the powers of Rome. And a little while later, he brings in these gold shields, and he tries to hang them in the Fortress Antonian. Each of those is a tribute to the Emperor Tiberius. He's trying to get in good with the Emperor Tiberius, so he has these golden shields with these images placed in the fortress in the Antonian Tower, which overlooks the courtyard. Of course, that created a huge hullabaloo. He's not going to give in now, because if he gives in, it's an insult to the emperor. I can't allow this people to insult the emperor. And finally, word gets all the way back to Tiberius himself. Tiberius has to send a letter saying, take down the shields. And that's embarrassing for him. And the Jews have won again. So on this particular morning when he wakes up and a mob of Jews shows out outside of his door, this is, for Pilate, it's like, oh, here we go again, right? And he's only in Jerusalem because it's the Passover festival. He only goes to Jerusalem for the couple of high holy holidays. Other than that, he's down in Caesarea. And the reason he's in Jerusalem is he brings troops with him because they expect unrest, and they expect during the high holy holidays of Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement and this one, the Passover, this is when all the Jews are going to be together. This is if the mob's going to riot. This is if they're going to see their strength in numbers. They think they can take over. This is where we're going to suppress them and kill them. So he marches in with hundreds of soldiers every time there's a high holy holiday. That's the only reason he's there. And now this mob shows up. Early in the morning, it's like, I'm sure he's like looking at his sundial. It's like, it's not even 8 o'clock in the morning yet. And it's the morning of the Passover. It's like showing up at your house on Christmas Eve day with a major court thing you want to have. And it's like, look, tomorrow's Christmas. It's Christmas Eve day. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing? And he wakes up and they bring this rabble-rouser Jesus in front of him. And I think this is the first part to kind of look at. It's like, he's sitting in judgment of Jesus, but it's really Jesus who's sitting in judgment of him. Isn't that the truth with all of us? When we first come to meet Jesus, it's like, all right, I'm going to do this examination and figure out who you really are, Jesus, if you're even real. I'm going to do this. I'm going to read some of your story. I'm going to ask some questions about you. But what's really happening is I'm sitting in judgment of you, Jesus. I'm going to determine whether you're real or not, whether you're true or not, whether you were anything at all, or I'm going to dismiss you. We think we're sitting in judgment of Jesus when we first meet him. And the whole time, he's sitting in judgment of us. So he comes face to face with Pilate. Back to John chapter 19. We'll start seeing what happens with Pilate. In John chapter 19, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. And it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered and they said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. And then Pilate said to them, you take him and charge him according to your law. Okay, so as the morning begins, they arrive, and you gotta just spit at the hypocrisy of these guys. They have just led 3 illegal trials where they have ramrodded a verdict of guilty so that they can get an execution on Jesus without any defense witnesses being called whatsoever. They paraded him through these illegal courts that met at night, which was illegal. They've already beaten their prisoner, which was illegal. Everything they've done up to now is illegal. They've had 3 trials pronouncing him guilty. They get to the praetorium to see the Pilate, and they're not going to actually walk into his courtyard because it's the Passover, and if we walk in there, God won't be pleased with us. We'll defile ourselves, right? You got to just look at the hypocrisy of that. Like, wait, you think you're being defiled because of stepping into the praetorium on the Passover? You don't think you're being defiled by lying, cheating, and ramrodding a death sentence and executing an innocent man? You don't think God considers that maybe a bigger deal? Evidently not. So they won't go into the praetorium, which is basically Pilate's palace quarters there. So they make Pilate come out with his troops to them to be out in this open, in this public. And of course, the interesting thing is, it doesn't really say, they just say he's an evildoer in John, but we read through Luke, and we know what the accusation is. Perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying he's Christ. And then they have to add, a king. Pilate's not going to know what a Christ is. He's not going to know the Messiah. He's not going to know what that means. So we have to interpret that. So here's what's wrong. He's perverting. He's a rebel rouser. He's just perverting our nation. He's telling people they don't have to pay taxes to Caesar, and he's claiming that he's a king. That's the charge they bring to Pilate, not the charge of blasphemy of claiming he's God. So they bring that charge to Pilate, and they have this weird encounter where they're trying to figure out what's going on here, and Pilate hears that this, okay, so Pilate says, well, then you take him and judge him according to your law, which is the second thing we often do when we meet Jesus. First, we sit in judgment of Jesus, and the second thing we do is we try to dismiss Jesus as only for religious people. Oh, Jesus, okay, that's for religious people. Yeah, that isn't me. I don't really get involved in that thing. I don't really have, so I tell you, you take Jesus, and you religious people go off with Jesus, and you do your own thing and leave me out of it. Right? How many times we have done that? where we're like, oh yeah, I'm just not into that whole religion thing. It's like, the thing is, Jesus isn't about that whole religion thing. Jesus is God himself, and you're coming face to face with God himself, and he won't be pawned off. John doesn't tell us this, but Luke does. The first thing that Pilate does, he goes, oh, he's a Galilean, and it's a religious thing. Oh, you know what? Herod's in town because it's Passover. Send him off to Herod. Let Herod take this one. Brush Jesus off. Get him away from me. I don't want to have to do it. Let this religious question go to the religious people. I'm going to stay out of it and not have to deal with Jesus at all. Of course, he goes to Herod. Herod, there's a little hullabaloo there. You can read about it in Luke chapter 23 if you want. And then Herod finds nothing wrong with him. Herod's a little upset that Jesus won't perform a miracle for him. And so they send Jesus back in a big robe. And after that, Herod and Pilate become friends. They weren't friends up to that day. But now they become friends over Jesus. And he sends him back. And Pilate sees that whatever's happening here is really important. They want Jesus killed. And it's kind of an interesting moment because if the Jewish people had the right to kill Jesus, the mode of death of public execution would have been stoning. It would have been all the community grabbing rocks and throwing them at Jesus until he was killed. Stoning requires breaking of bones. Bones get broken in a stoning. But the Old Testament had prophesied that not one of Jesus' bones would be broken. That was one of the signs to tell if he was the Messiah. That's why it's a big deal on the cross when the other two criminals' legs are broken, but Jesus is not. His sides are pierced. It had prophesied his bones won't be broken. The method of execution that the Romans did for anyone who wasn't a Roman citizen was crucifixion. The crucifixion style of execution is interesting because it's the thing Jesus had been prophesying. He'd been prophesying, I'm going to be lifted up. And if I'm lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. And they knew what it meant. Lifted up meant you're going to be hanging on the cross. You're going to be executed. That doesn't make any sense how someone executed could draw all men at him. He had also said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man be lifted up. And all that we'll see, it had this interesting thing. That was from 1,500 years before when Moses made a bronze serpent, lifted it up on a pole when the whole nation was being attacked by these venomous snakes, and anyone who looked to the serpent was cured. And Jesus was saying to the same thing. It's like anyone who looks to me hanging on the cross will be cured. Cured of their sins, cured of their pains, cured of their ailments. He was saying that. And so this interesting thing is happening, and Pilate is trying to get rid of Jesus, make him a religious question. You deal with him. I'm just going to step back and have nothing to do with Jesus. I want to go about my business. Send him off to Herod, but Herod sends him back, and he can't get away from him. And then Pilate is forced to take a closer look at Jesus, as we often are. There comes a moment when we have to take a closer look at him. It's like I can't just brush him off as a religion. I can't just brush him off as, that's a Christian thing. Yeah, I'm really not into that. There comes moments in our lives we have to say, look, who is this Jesus guy? Not what is Christianity, but who is Jesus? He comes back to Pilate. And beginning in verse 33, we see the rest. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, and he called Jesus. And he said to him, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? And Jesus answered, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. It is interesting as he begins to take a closer look at Jesus. He has to stand in front of Jesus, and he's trying to hammer out, okay, I'm just really not into your whole religion thing, but something's going on here I can't grasp, and now you're back before me, and the simple dismissal of calling you a religious problem didn't make you go away. Here you are again. What am I to do with you? And he starts confronting Jesus on, well, what have you done? And I can imagine, he's like, look, there's a mob out there crying for you to be executed, and I still don't understand the crime. I'm still trying to figure out what the accusation is. What is it you have done that makes those guys outside be the way they are? And then they have this dialogue about Jesus being the king. And he says, I have a kingdom, but my kingdom is not of this world. And he starts peeling the layers back for Pilate to see. I'm something bigger than you realize. I'm something beyond this world. I'm beyond politics. I am beyond anything you have ever known before. I am beyond the systems of economics that you use and the systems of social stratification that you use. I'm beyond all of the systems you know. All of the ways you handle money, all the ways you treat people, all the ways you decide who has power, who does not have power. I am something beyond all of that. My kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate's like, okay, so you're a king then, right? He tries to bring everything back. Sort of like the people that say, okay, so Jesus is a good moral teacher. Okay, so Jesus was a good guy. Okay, so maybe Jesus did some miracles, but they still humanize him. It's like I can't come to the point where I'm realizing Jesus is beyond humanity. I can't see that. And then Jesus starts to lay out something more about who he was, who he is. He says, I came for this reason, that I should tell people the truth. What does he mean when he says that? It means that everything Jesus spoke, every word he gave, every illustration he used, every example he told, every metaphor, every allegory, everything he had to speak at all was the ultimate truth of the universe. Jesus came to inform humanity what is real. What is real? In this whole world you're in, I'm here to tell you what is real and what is not. And he would say these interesting things about heaven, about hell. He would say these things about your immortal soul. He would say these fascinating things about how we treat each other. He would say things about rank and file and who's greatest and who's the servant of all and how this whole thing should be flipped upside down. Jesus came saying, everything I came is to tell you what is true. I came to bear witness to the truth. I am the one who tells all of humanity what reality is. Which is an interesting implication because it implies all of humanity lives in a cloudy fogginess of deceit. All of humanity goes through life kind of we're groping in the dark, in the fog, trying to figure out what is true because the deceit has so blinded us, and some of the deceit is so far inwoven in our hearts and in our minds, in our social systems, in our society structures that we can't even see it anymore. Right? One of the things I was reading in David Swanson's book early on, he said in the 1960s there was a sociologist who went through the South in 1960, and he asked all the people, is there a racism problem in America? And every white person he talked to said, well, there used to be, but we're fine now. In 1960, there hadn't been a Civil Rights Act passed yet. There were still Jim Crow laws, right? And every black person, he said, was, oh yeah, there's a race problem. And so we have these things that happen to us where we get so blinded by the norm of what is. We live in this normalness, not even realizing our normalness might be corrupt and broken and unjust and painful. And that's the deceit and the fog we live in. And Jesus came saying, yeah, I have come to cut through all of that and get you to what is true. Get you to understand truth. That's what he came to. And Pilate sitting there looking at him, he realizes Jesus is having this claim over truth. And if he has the claims over what is true, it means this. There's really only, well, C.S. Lewis thought there were 3 answers. I think there's 2. It means either Jesus was right or Jesus was lying. Right? The third answer that C.S. Lewis throws in there is, oh, he might have been crazy and insane. I think you can't read about Jesus and the effect Jesus had and list him as a crazy man, right? That's just too impossible. And the miracles and stuff, yeah, we'll rule out craziness. So either Jesus is telling the truth or Jesus is lying. Either Jesus is the ultimate one who can tell you all about why your life is the way it is and can tell you how to fix the things that are wrong and can tell you there's meaning and purpose and a plan behind your life, even the painful things that have happened. Either Jesus has all the answers or he's lying and he doesn't have any answers at all. Those are our 2 choices to face. Either he's telling us the truth or he's lying. We do the next thing Pilate did. When we're faced with that truth that Jesus has all the answers or he's a liar, we want to compromise with him. We kind of want to be on Jesus' side, but not fully. Maybe it's because of fear of others. And in verse 39 through 40, we see Pilate's compromise. He goes outside, he says, but then you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And then they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Reading on. It says, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and then they said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. And Pilate then went out again, and he said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, Behold the man! Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him! And Pilate said, You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. But the Jews answered, We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Let's hold right here. Pilate knows this guy's innocent, and they want him dead. And maybe I can compromise just enough with Jesus and just enough with the crowd, where I can do something that would make it so that Jesus is brutally beaten, but he's not killed, and he'll survive it, and he'll heal, and eventually he'll be okay. He'll remember it, though, and he'll carry scars from it, but he won't be executed. If I have him beaten and flogged, then I can bring him out and I can parade his flogged, beaten, bloody carcass in front of this crowd, and their bloodthirstiness will be subsided, and maybe a little mercy will pop up in them, and they'll say, Oh, that looks bad. I guess that's good enough. And he's wanting to compromise with this move of I'll have him scourged. Interesting, wait, you just said you found him innocent, and yet you're going to have him scourged. He's like, yeah, I'm finding him innocent. There's nothing wrong with this guy. But if I have him beaten, it'll mollify the mob. I care more what the mob's going to do than I care about the conversation I've had with Jesus himself. I fear others more than I fear this guy. That's where Pilate's at. And then Pilate even goes the extra extreme. Oh, I know, I got a plan. I can let him go by presenting an even worse candidate. If I bring Barabbas out of the jail, Barabbas a thief and a robber, he would be our equivalent of a terrorist today. We would say this is a guy who has executed and killed people on the highways. He has been this ruffian who has been a thief and a robber. He has plundered. He has done hideous things, and he's a murderer. I'll bring this terrorist out, this known terrorist out. And of course, if I compare Jesus to a known terrorist, they're going to pick Jesus. Who wants Barabbas, that terrorist? Nobody wants him. And that backfires on him too. He's trying to do this compromise. And he's trying to get out of having to make a decision about Jesus. It's an interesting thing. He brings Jesus out beaten. In this very famous phrase, he says, Behold the man. In Latin, it's ecce homo. In the Greek text, he actually says, Ho anthropos, where we get the word anthropology. It's an interesting term. Jesus comes out beaten, savagely bloodied. He's got the crown of thorns. He's been punched. His face is bruised. His back is marred. Chunks of flesh have been ripped off him. And Pilate says, Behold, and almost saying this, Behold the ultimate man. That's what he's saying. He doesn't even know he's saying it. And Jesus is standing there as the representation of all mankind. The punishment, the wrath that's being poured out on the sins of mankind, he's standing there representing all of mankind. Pilate doesn't even realize what he's saying. The Jews don't even realize what he's saying. We only realize what he's saying because the text gets handed down to us. And in that moment when Pilate thinks it's all going to go away and I've got this compromise where I don't have to be fully on Jesus' side and I can be partly on the crowd's side, but I can also admit there's something cool about Jesus at the same time, that he's innocent. I can stand in both worlds simultaneously if I just do this thing. And how many of us do that? We try to find a way to stand with one foot in Jesus' side and one foot in the world's side, and we think I can negotiate both of these okay. Sometimes I need to compromise you, Jesus, because I have fear of the crowd. And sometimes the crowd, I have to say, no, crowd, you've gone overboard now. Jesus is still okay about stuff. We're always trying to do that. We're trying to figure out how can we live with one foot in the world and one foot in Christ's camp. And Jesus won't let us do that. Jesus won't let us compromise that way. He will constantly push us to the point of realizing you have to choose between me or Barabbas. There has to be a choice. Only one will be let go and one will be crucified. There's a choice. We have to choose between Jesus and the world. Verse 7 of chapter 19, we're going on, says, the Jews answered, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And he went again into the praetorium, and he said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. And then Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? And Jesus answered, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the pavement seat, or the judgment seat, in a place that is called the pavement, for in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king! But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. It's an interesting moment because Pilate has a chance to say, I'm either all in with Jesus or I'm afraid of the crowd. And in the end, he's afraid of the crowd. And I would love to say, oh, well, Pilate was being swept up in this great sea of events that were going to happen. It had been prophesied that Jesus knew was going to happen, that God the Father had planned. He knew the crucifixion was going to happen. This was going to happen. So Pilate is innocent, but notice Jesus doesn't call him innocent. Jesus says, oh, they're more guilty. They have the greater sin. But he didn't say, you have no sin at all. And injustice remains an injustice even if good stuff comes out of it. A lot of the laws that we have in the land are because some injustice happened to a person, and we didn't have a law to fix that injustice. And so we create these laws to say we want to see that injustice never happens again. And that's how we get laws about all kinds of different things, from economics and credit card use and everything, and from unjust arrest. You know, Miranda rights is named after a guy named Miranda who was arrested and not told he could keep silent. Those were his rights. Just because something good comes out of an injustice doesn't mean the injustice was okay. And here's what's happening. Pilate's going to commit an injustice, and it isn't going to be okay. He still is going to carry this sin. And it's interesting when he stands before Jesus, says, I have the power to decide over you. And it's almost like Jesus, I don't even know, I wish I could have heard the tone in his voice. You would have no power at all. This is all being decided up in heaven. The only power you're having is to make this choice one way or the other right now. You know, Jesus knew, I'm going to be crucified. Even if Pilate steps away from this whole thing right now, I'm going to be crucified. You're just deciding what part you're going to play in it. But the real power is the throne of heaven. God is the one who's deciding. And somehow through the corridors of time, God had picked that Pilate would be standing there. He would be the governor at that particular time. Why did he want Pilate to be the governor at that particular moment? Maybe because he knew Pilate's heart. Maybe because he knew, if I have Pilate standing there, Jesus will go to the cross, because I know what kind of man Pilate is. There'd be one more incident after Jesus. We'd know from the historians, Josephus and Philo, the philosopher, and others, that what would happen, there'd be one more massive incident. It would be so bad, and some guys would get killed, that Pilate would be recalled to Rome for being a bad governor on this last incident. And before he makes it to Rome, Tiberius dies, and he never has to give an account. And then he kind of disappears from history. One later historian who isn't so trustworthy says he was given a farm up in Gaul, modern-day France, and said, just retire up there. But we do know there's one more incident that's going to happen, which will get him removed from being governor. And when they say, if you let this man go, you are not a friend of Caesar. That was really the moment it put Pilate in a predicament. A guy named Sejanus, who was a head of the Praetorian Guard and a great military general, had just tried to lead a coup against Tiberius, and the coup had failed. And everybody who was in any way connected to Sejanus had been executed. His own son and daughter were strangled, right? 10 years old, 8-year-old. They were strangled. Everybody who had anything to do with Sejanus was was completely executed. And there are some historians who think that Pilate got his position from the recommendation of Sejanus. So what Pilate's really trying to do is lay low. And when you're using his phrase, friend of Caesar or not a friend of Caesar, it had to do with 2 years earlier. You're either on Caesar's side or you're on Sejanus' side, and if you're not a friend of Caesar, you're going to die. And so Pilate, in this rock and the hard place, uses it, and he asks the Jews, wait a minute, you want me to crucify your king? This guy's your king. And when they say, we have no king but Caesar, politically, Pilate just won. He just won when he got the high priest and all these council of leaders and all these elders to admit Rome is your king. Because all this time, all these fights we've had, you've been claiming God's your king and that Rome is only a political entity coming here and taking taxes, but you've not bowed to Rome. And when they cry out, we have no king but Caesar, they have bowed to Rome. And their God is now taken second place. And Pilate's sitting there like, I just won. I just won. They said we have no king but Caesar. I've won. Okay, crucify this guy. Now, he'll wash his hands of this crime, but he knows he's won. But actually, he's lost because he couldn't think and see big enough. I was last weekend down in Kennewick. We were staying at this great little place, this little bed and breakfast, and this couple who ran it was just delightfully wonderful. I loved so much. I'm going to definitely go back there. And she is a chaplain at a local hospital. And of course, we had great conversations at night. Her chaplaincy has led her to have to examine, a lot of other faiths, and Judaism, and some Islam, and some Baha'i, and some Confucian, all sorts of different things she'll encounter as a chaplain. Her roots are in Catholicism. She grew up a Catholic, and we were having this great dialogue about people and God and the moment of death when people are thinking about God and what happens in a hospital room and this kind of thing, and what people conceive about the beyond and the afterlife, and what she thought and what I thought. And at one point in the conversation, she said, you speak so confidently and so boldly in what you believe. And for a second I was like, is she insulting me or is she praising me? I can't tell. Well, I'll take it as a compliment. I don't think it was an insult because she was just such a wonderful person. But that made me think a lot as I kind of walked away from that conversation. Over the next several days, I got to thinking about, I guess that's what it is. At some point in my life, you're all in with Jesus, and I became all in with Jesus. No holds barred. Nothing held back. It's like, this is my life, these are my family, these are my relationships, this is what I own, this is where I live, this is what I do. And I slid it all into the table and said, I'm betting it all on Jesus. I'm betting it all on Jesus. Everything I have, everything I will become. And it comes down to, is he telling us the truth or is he a liar? I've taken my whole life and I pushed it to this center of the table, and I said, okay, I call your hand, Jesus. I'm betting everything on you. Because I think you're the real thing. And when you said you told the truth, you did. You are the truth teller. And some of us in the room have been there and done that. And some of us find, occasionally, I thought I bet everything on Jesus, but there's something in my life I held to myself, and I got to now push that. And I say, that goes in all in too. You got to be all in with Jesus. And I realized in that conversation, what she said was confidence and boldness was just someone who was all in on Jesus. All in on Jesus. This is who he is. This is what he said. His death and resurrection, it was a planned event. The people that were participated in the injustice are still guilty. But when he stood before Pilate and said, I'm the one who tells you what is true, he still says that. And he still invites all of us today. That same thing, he's inviting all of us. Take your life, all of your relationships, all the things you own, where you live, your education, your talent, your experiences, your personality, who your favorite, what your favorite activities are, everything about you. From your hobbies to your family to your friendships to your possessions to your talents and your skills and ability, you scoop them together and you got to push them to the center and you say, I'm all in on you, Jesus. Here it is. It's all yours. Tell me what to do with it, because I trust you are who you said you are. I trust you will do what you said you would do. I trust that in the end, you are the only one with all the real answers. This society, this America could tumble down. The great civilization, we've built a great civilization. We're a stupid culture, but we're a great civilization. Our great civilization could fall, and I'm all in with you, Jesus. I'm all in with you and your death and your resurrection for my sins. I realize you stood on that platform in front of those people having been beaten because really you were taking the weight of the punishment I deserved. And when you died on the cross, you took the punishment I deserved. And you stood in between me and the wrath of righteousness that was falling on wicked and sinful humanity. And all he does now is he says, I just to invite you to believe me. That's really what, how do you know if you're a Christian? Well, do you believe everything? Did you believe Jesus was the real thing or not? And if the answer is yes, he's the real thing, it's like, well, that's all he said. He who believes in him has eternal life. And that invitation to belief is always extended. It's extended right now. And there might be someone in the room or some watching at home who are like, I never really thought. I thought I could have one foot in all the things I wanted to do and one foot, on Jesus. I thought I could have both Barabbas and Jesus. But you can't. Jesus is like, all in with me. All in with me or nothing at all. Right? He who is not for me is against me. He who does not gather with me scatters. That's what Jesus said. It's like, oh, those are big words. And he's saying the same thing to us. And he promises the exchange of every promise that he's ever given for those who are his. I was just reading Isaiah 65 last night where he's talking to this wicked nation. He says this great stuff in there about, hey, you'll go hungry, but my servants will be well fed. You'll be destitute, but my servants will be taken care of. Your fields will wither and die. My servants' fields will be fine. And he says these promises that no matter what happens in society, I'll take care of you. And those promises are still true. And all he says to us is, I just ask him one thing. Do you believe me? He says to us. And a lot of times we don't. But he's always challenging us, do we believe him? As the band comes up, I want to close. And I just asked them they're going to sing a great, I think it's a belief song. I think it's a song that just gets us to understand who he is. And I would ask that as this song is being sung, let it be a commitment from your heart. Let it be the time when you say, okay, Jesus, I'm going to be all in with you. This is my moment of proclamation. This is my moment when I say who I am, what I have, who I know, what I do. I'm going to push it all and I say, Jesus, it all belongs to you. You are my Lord and Savior. You are the one who proclaims truth. You're the one who knows reality. And in that, invite him in your own mind, in your own heart. Just say, I'm just going to invite you to take it. I'm going to invite you, all the stuff I'm just going to push to the center and say, there it is, Jesus, it's yours. I'm all in with you. Take it and you have it. Do with it what you will. And invite him then to say, and fill my heart, fill my mind with the power of your Spirit. Fill me up with who you are so that I know I can feel and experience this truth. Let's worship in prayer.
The love of God is greater far than tongue open can ever tell. It goes beyond the highest star and reaches to the lowest hell. The guilty bear, but thou with grace, God gave his son. treasureless and strong. It shall forevermore endure. The saints and angels' song.
Lord God Almighty, King of heaven and earth and the stars and the planets and all that is and will be and is yet to come, Lord, help us to remember that you are here, God. So many times in our earthly lives do we forget about your glory and your might and who you are, Jesus. We get so wrapped up in our societal laws and our daily to-do lists and our things that we need to have happen, Lord, that we forget about who you are, who you've always said that you will be, what you always said that you will do. Jesus, help us to know that when you are standing straight in front of us, that you are our God. You are King of everything, of our hearts and our minds and our bodies and our souls, Lord. And you won't lie. You won't let us fall. You won't have anything bad happen to our life because you love us. When you are standing straight in front of us, God, help us to remember who you are. Wake us up, Jesus. Wake us up and help us to remember that it is not about our earthly lives, it is about our heavenly lives and the treasures that you have for us in heaven, God. Thank you so much for everything that you have done for us, everything that you are doing for us, and everything that you will do for us, God. Thank you, Jesus.